Ellie Shields here for Cowkind Media. How much do you know about the G7? Keep watching to find out. But before we get into it, please give a sub to our channel and press the bell icon to get notified on our latest videos. The Group of Seven, popularly known as G7, is a group of 7 countries: the US, the UK, Canada, France, Germany, Japan, and Italy. The heads of which hold an annual summit to address the issues of mutual concern. As of date, there is a lot of buzz surrounding the impending G7 meeting that was held last weekend. An informal group, it usually invites the European Union or other countries to attend the annual summit. As a combined force, these 7 countries represent 2/5 of the world's economy and 1/10 of the world's population, which makes it one of the richest blocs in the world. However, the problem is that unlike other multinational bodies such as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or NATO, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, or the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation or SAARC, the G7 has no legal existence, which in a way means that decisions made at the G7 meetings also have no binding impacts on policy. This would mean that the commitments made at G7 meetings need to be ratified independently by governing bodies. In most cases, parliaments or member states, to put it simply, it's a perspective sharing forum where these 7 countries zero in on common goals to look out for. So when did G7 start? Well, the history of G7, it goes around 50 years back to 1975. That year, the global economy was going through a rough recession due to the organization of petroleum exporting countries, oil embargo in retaliation to Arab-Israel war. The world back then was heavily dependent on the Arab countries for oil consumption, which led to an energy crisis in the Western world, with long queues outside the petrol pumps. To help themselves out of the situation, the then Treasury Secretary US George Shultz carried on the meeting of 6 countries. The thought was that it would be beneficial for the major economies of the world to synchronize efforts with each other on macro initiatives. Canada, at that point in time, was not a part of the invitees. This is how G7 started. This became an annual ritual. However, for almost 1.5 decades, this group has become G8. In the post-Cold War era, when Soviet Union collapsed, the West had found a new ally in Boris Yeltsin, the new president of Russia. So the G7 invited Russia also to join the bandwagon. That is how it became G8 in 1998. In 2014, however, after Russia overnight annexure of Crimea in Ukraine, it got expelled from the grouping. So who heads the G7? The head of the grouping is selected on an alternative basis. Every year, the president of G7 meetings is rotated. That is, each of the countries gets a chance to head the G7 grouping every 7 years. With the presidency of the grouping comes the responsibility of hosting the event for each country. Since this time around, the UK was heading the G7. The annual summit happened in Cowdes Bay Hotel in Cornwall, UK through the last week. The guest invitee countries that include India, South Korea, and Australia will be attending the summit only in the afternoon session. So what is the importance of the G7? Well, since the G7 makes up 40% of the world's economy and has the world's only superpower, the US, as its member, the grouping helps in setting the global narrative and given birth to many global initiatives, from pumping $300 million to contain the after effects of Chernobyl's meltdown, to launching a global response to the pandemic disease like malaria and AIDS. It also helps in the financing of activities, as the group has set apart $45 billion in the form of global aid until now. The group has also lobbied for the steps to curb climate change, which ultimately has led to the Paris Climate Accord. Impressed? Well, not so fast. They also have a few shortfalls. The G7 is very prone to domestic political churning within the member countries. Similarly, Mr. Trump, due to his unpleasant off-the-cut remarks, shared a strained relationship with other G7 leaders. The differences with Angela Merkel of Germany and Theresa May of the UK were even visible to the public eye during the bilateral meeting. In the earlier days, the G7 meetings were closed door and discreet in nature. However, given the importance of these countries, at least economically, these actions had global ramifications. This led to the intentional criticism, and that is why it announces the agenda for their meetings in advance. Well, if you like this info, please like, share, and comment on the video. Give our channel a sub, and while you're at it, press that bell icon for regular updates on our latest videos. Don't forget to log on to our website at kalkinemedia.com. This has been Holly Shields for Kalkine Media.